Thanks for joining us once again on the Reasonable Theology podcast. I am joined once again by a return guest. We have Troy Frasier from the Revived Thoughts podcast. He's the co founder of Revived Thoughts, which really has formed into Revived Studios, which is a network of helpful podcasts that includes Revived Thoughts and a number of others, which help to bring church history along with some of the great sermons from church history and fascinating backstories of the men who preach them. And Troy, just want to say welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
You bet. Now, for those that maybe didn't catch that first episode that we had a chance to talk, that was way back on episode 17 of the Reasonable Theology podcast. Can you share a little bit about Revived Thoughts and how that even came to be?
For starters, I want to say thank you for having us on. I don't know how many of your listeners know this, but if you were to go back to that episode 17, that was the very first interview I had done with on any podcast anywhere. At this point, I've done probably over 50 of those. I was really nervous, very excited. You were very patient as I had about 1,000 technical issues, if I recall correctly. So I'm really grateful that you had us on, and it was really cool for us. What we do at Revive Thoughts, our main podcast, well, not our main, but the podcast I co-host, we take sermons from the past and we edit them, and we have different people from all over the world speak them. In fact, you'll be speaking a sermon for us here that will be coming out pretty soon, and then we allow people to hear the backstory of those sermons. So you're able to kind of learn about the person you're hearing from, hear a sermon as if it was preached by that person. And we have found that this combination really reaches a lot of people and helps them to kind of bring history back to life. One of the greatest compliments we sometimes get is people will be like, "I feel like I'm in the pew after hearing the backstory," and that's exactly the vibe and the goal that we've gone for. And we found that it's been really accessible for a lot of people who are interested in church history or interested in somebody have been able to kind of mesh that way through that approach. It's also been really interesting to see how many people who we did never expected this audience, but about almost 1/5 of our audience are English as second language people who are really interested in deeper theology or different aspects of those kind of things, but English isn't their first language. So reading an old book by a Puritan is kind of outside of something they feel capable of doing, but being able to listen to a sermon that's been edited, that does feel like something they feel capable of doing. So it's been really cool to see how a group of people we never thought to reach has actually been getting reached by that podcast as well. Our other big show is Martyrs and Missionaries, which is hosted by my wife, and she goes through every 2 weeks or so, putting out an episode about a martyr and or missionary and telling their different life stories, or sometimes doing the overview of a history. For example, the rise and fall of Christianity in Japan, or the rise and fall of Christianity in Greenland, and things like that. So that's just some of what we do, but those are probably the two biggest things we do.
Yeah, and it's a really helpful show. I encourage people to check that out. Obviously, link to our earlier conversation in the show notes back to episode 17. I'll link over to your various podcasts too, and just recommend people check them out. It really is helpful. It really does bring some of these things to life. And my favorite part is just the introduction to each of those sermons where you give a lot of that backstory, either of the individual, what was happening in their life at the time, what was happening in the broader culture at the time. Some of that stuff is really tremendously interesting. So I recommend people check that out. I'll put all those links in the show notes. You can check that out at reasonabletheology.org/Troy, and you can get any of the resources that we're talking about along the way in the conversation. So clearly, you have a great interest, a great passion for church history. Why is it important for Christians to learn about the history of the faith?
Christianity is a old faith. It's 2,000 years. Of course, we connect with the Old Testament. The Old Testament is written down for us, uh, but the New Testament, after Acts, it ends. But the story of God working through history has not ended. Now, that doesn't make church history and everything people do, of course, is not inspired to the same level of Scripture. But if you look at church, I mean, if you look at Scripture, you look at the Old Testament, how often do the people start by giving a recount or a history of how they got there? I mean, even in Acts, even in Stephen the Martyr's sermon, in his story in Acts, you see him going back and going, "Well, let me tell the story of how we got here. First we were in Israel, then we were, they go through this history. It's so important to God to repeat and keep the history of what happened to his people in their minds. And now, so often, modern Christians have kind of detached themselves from history. They kind of float away from all that as if we no longer stand on the shoulders of giants that we've been learning from all this time after 2,000 years, as if we're just kind of in this blob. We don't really know how we got here, right? That's not the case. In fact, we come from a long line of different Christian people who have helped bring us to this place that we are at now. You are not a Christian if you are listening to the show by accident, but at some point somebody got saved, that got saved, that got saved, and they brought that to you, and you'll pass that hopefully, and Lord willing, on to others as well. You're a part of a link in a chain. I don't think God has stopped caring about the history of his people. And on a personal note, it's very encouraging and challenging, convicting, and yet also growing to learn about how you got to where you are. So often people are looking for mentors or looking for people to lead them or looking for people to help them grow in their faith. And I'm telling you that a great resource of those people are the ones that have already lived. I can tell you a lot of great things that I, know people have done, but if I can point you to people who have lived incredible lives, lives that would be unbelievable if you met them in person, those people can grow you too. When you look at someone like Hudson Taylor, or you look at somebody like William Carey, or you look at some of the lives that these John G. Payton, and you look at the things these people did for the gospel, it will challenge and convict you deeply in your own walk with God. And on the flip side, when you see what people have been willing to put up with, when you see the way Gresham Machen was kind of thrown out of his own church, or Jonathan Edwards was thrown out of his own church,
Yeah.
or when you see the depression that Charles Spurgeon fought, his entire life, when you see the people throwing stuff at him that John Calvin had to endure in Geneva, or when you see the fact that George Whitefield was locked out of all his churches and had to put barrels together and stand in the marketplace, and when you see all these different things that people have experienced, and see the Black Plague and what it did and how Christians still held on, even in London in 1600s, long after they knew what the Black Plague could do to you, when everyone else ran out of London when Black Plague hit in 1665, it was the ministers who came back into the city to preach Christ to people before they died. And it was just when you see that, then you suddenly look at your own life and go, I can persevere through it. You won't find any experience in this life that someone hasn't lived through pretty much in church history at some point. You
Yeah.
can turn to them and learn from them and kind of learn and find models, I think, that will challenge and grow you deeply.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at that, all the practical implications there are from having a grasp of church history. You mentioned some of those of really just having a longer view, perhaps, probably more an eternal timeline that you're looking at and being able to endure things. How have you personally been shaped by church history?
Absolutely. I've been changed by it a lot. For starters, it's helped me to learn to think a little bit more. When I read the writings and the books and the things that they have written and down, I realize that God wants us to be using our brains, that actually that is something we've been created to use and be a part of us. And I think that, it's easy to look at. Sometimes you'll see people today and like, oh, people are arguing theology, they're arguing this and that's bad. I'm like, oh, you look at church history, it's pretty normal. It's actually pretty par for the course of what we've been doing the whole time. And not that we should be known as a bickering people, but maybe it's okay that we go back and forth on ideas and are thinking them through, because God gave us a brain that's been helpful for us, I think, for a long time. Also, practically speaking, it's challenged me not to be complacent in my faith. It's very easy when you're living in a modern world to look around you and look at the other Christians around you and go, okay, I'm fine. I may have I feel like I have these dreams or these little pricks in my heart where I'm like, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing that. But then I look around and I go, oh, no one else is doing it. It's probably not that important. It's okay. I'm just fine right where I am, right? And when you look at church history and then you see the things that people like George Mueller did without a penny, caring for 10,000 orphans, or David Livingston did, working back and forth across Africa to help end the slave trade there, and then his disciple Henry M. Stanley doing the same thing. When you see all these great things that others have done, or it's not always adventurers. There are people writing books. There are people doing this, that. They're willing to take heat for it. But whatever it is, then you look at your own life and then you go, oh man, I do have a lot of room actually to grow after all. And I don't really have a lot of room to complain about that painful growth that needs to occur, because I am nowhere near where I need to be when I compare myself to these giants. And I go, that's okay. I've got a lot to learn from them, and that's good. The other thing too is I just think that it's also both. It will convict you, and it will encourage you. Because when you look at the state of the church today, you might be tempted to go, "Oh my goodness, 5 alarm bells, everything's a mess. Oh no, what do we do? What do we do?" And it isn't great, but also the church has withstood a lot of stuff throughout the ages, and you realize the church has survived pandemics, the church has survived wars, the church has survived persecution. That doesn't mean it was pleasant for the people going through it, but God is ultimately very much in control of what happens to his church. And so you're going to be okay. Even if you can't, you might not make it through, but you're going to be okay because you're just going to be following in line with a bunch of other people who didn't make it through.
Yeah. And all those things are really practically useful and helpful. We even see that in scripture, don't we? You look at, Hebrews 11, the what we refer to as the hall of faith. These things are given, these examples are given and pointed to as a reason to keep on going, keep on moving. So you even look in the book of James when he's looking and pointing to these Old Testament saints who endured hardships, he's writing to Christians who are enduring hardships. And we're supposed to look at these things not only for comfort, but sometimes for a kick in the pants when we need to press on and move forward and perhaps give a little bit more effort and zeal into our walk.
Absolutely. I think we too often see the idea of hardship as something that needs to be avoided as much as possible. And or sometimes people will make kind of a god out of hardship, like I'm going to suffer extra willingly. And the idea, I don't think church history says that. I think when you look through so many people, you're going to see so many people survive and endured hardship and they didn't prefer it, but they got through it. But also you're going to see that, man, it is very normal to go through very hard things, loss of jobs or a loss of family members or a loss of whatever it is. That's a very normal thing. It's a very normal thing for the people of God to go through. You are not alone in that. In fact, most of us could not endure the amount of loss that these people would end up going through on a pretty regular basis. And I'm blown away by how much these people suffered for Christ and how much they just gave up. David Livingston, I think, outlived his wife, outlived some of his kids. Henry M. Stanley ended up just completely seeing horrible things that happen to other humans, trauma that would just, I think, break so many of us. And you can go through so many different stories and see the ways that they suffered greatly. And that's just a normal part of it for the walk with God. I think sometimes today we forget that suffering is a pretty normal part of our walk with God, not
Yeah.
unexpected. I did an interview with Dr. Oz Guinness about a year ago this time, and he said that his own parents had to bury two of the children as they were leaving China because of the communist revolution happening. And I asked him, I said, how do your parents do that and keep their faith? And he said they just weren't expecting anything different when following God. They assumed that suffering was a part of the road because that's the same road that Jesus took. And so it wasn't a surprise
Wow.
to them, even though it was horrible, it wasn't a surprise to them when bad things happened. And I'm like, that's a perspective I think that is rooted in truth and in church history and in understanding our faith. And I think we've moved greatly from that in too many places in the modern faith. And we need to recognize, we need to get back to that idea that like there's going to be suffering. And that's not a sign that God isn't real or that God has abandoned us, but that's actually a pretty normal expectation for what we should go through.
Yeah. And really you look at what most of the listeners, people watching this conversation, their experience and their parents' experience and probably their parents' experience in the church in the West, particularly in America, has been relatively comfortable and relatively easygoing on the whole. Obviously, there's lots of different hardships that people endure individually and within the church, but when you compare to church history, we're really an anomaly,
Yeah.
and persecution and hardship and trials, that's the norm. And I think people are starting to see on the horizon that things are going to get a little bit more normal for
Yeah.
the church in the West, and we can be steeled for that. We can be prepared for that by having a greater appreciation, understanding of what God has done for His church, sustaining it throughout history. And when we're talking about church history, we see the benefit of it. People might have an interest in it, but we're talking about a really big topic. As you mentioned at the start, we're talking over 2,000 years of stuff here. Could you think of some ways to maybe break that down into smaller periods or eras that people could look into that would be helpful?
Yeah, if I were to recommend periods to start with, a lot of people will recommend starting with the Protestant Reformation. There's this clear break in church history moment between the Catholic Church
Yeah.
being the only game in town to there being now the Protestant movement. I don't think that's a bad one. I think if you start with 95 Theses, Martin Luther, and that's your very first spring off place to go, that's not a bad place to start at all. A lot of other people might recommend you go back to early church history and kind of start with where Acts leaves off, see what happens in those first few centuries while the church is under persecution under Rome. Those are two great places. Another personal favorite of mine is the missionary kind of century of the 1800s, where if you want some really exciting stories that will challenge you, go look at what William Carey, Felix Carey, Peter Parker, not the Spider-Man, but the guy who went to China as the medical missionary, and Hudson Taylor. Look at David Livingston. Look at these people who went around, Adoniram Judson, and these incredible people who went around the world spreading the good news in the 1800s, and see how much the faith spread out because of these people who were willing to sacrifice a whole lot. I think that century will really challenge us today more than maybe any other. And I always recommend that's a good place to go to, seeing how Christianity hit other places and what the effect was. Sometimes it was positive, you know. In China, it spread like crazy until communism kind of did it, did a number on it. And then other places, it had a really hard time, and just kind of recognizing that's going to go both ways sometimes. Those are good places. I always also recommend that if you can, steer clear of church history textbooks. It's kind of the opposite of what a lot of people will tell you, but I found for me that biographies and stories and people were a far easier way to understand and study church history and stay passionate about the story of church history than reading through a textbook and being like, at this point, the Apollinarian controversy showed up and council such and such dealt with that. And it involved this, that, and the other. And not that the textbooks are bad, they can be good. But I find too, I think for a lot of people, the textbooks kill the passion, whereas reading the stories of the people living will reinvigorate your passion without a doubt. It's kind of like the difference between if I'm a lot of times people with theology, they'll say, where should you start? And they'll systematic theology. I'm like, I don't know if you should start with systematic theology. I actually think you should go pick up J.C. Ryle's book on holiness, or you should go pick up, St. Augustine's Confession. Start reading the theological books that shaped the systematic theology first, I think sometimes.
No, I think those are both helpful things that you said. Is one, just recognizing that there's just these different eras. I think a lot of Christians make the mistake of thinking, not explicitly, but by default, we've got the early church, and then some Christians were put in the Colosseum, and then we had the Reformation, and then Billy Graham came along, and now there's my church. And like
Yeah.
that's the history of Christianity. And obviously there's so much more to that. You mentioned, the early church, we got them persecution under Rome, and then being, really the state religion of Rome. We've got the Middle Ages, we've got the Reformation, we've got these periods of revival, we got the Puritans, we've got the modern era, all this great breadth and depth of church history to look at. And I agree with you. I see there is benefit in textbooks and things to the point where you get kind of the lay of the land and the chronology and see maybe how things led to one thing or another. But I agree wholeheartedly. And one of the things that I really took away from one of my seminary classes in church history was we were reading the primary accounts of these things. Yes, we were shown, how things interrelated and they were doing it in chronological order, but we're reading, Luther's letters to somebody. We're reading a treatise that was written for a particular issue rather than just reading about them. And I think that's good and helpful for history study in general, particularly in church history. I think you get a lot more out of it, and like you said, it
Mm.
really helps you retain some of that passion and get a lot more interest in it too.
Yeah, I think that if you're gonna try to approach history, it's kind of like doing. I think a good maybe it's similar is you're gonna learn about science, but you're never gonna pick up and try to do a science experiment. You're gonna
Right.
have maybe some theoretical knowledge of science, but certainly you're gonna be lacking what the guy who picks up the chemicals and starts mixing them together and observing them and writing them down. That's what history is. You have to find those people that are your science experiments. It doesn't mean you don't need the others sometimes, but I'll be honest, I think that once you start doing more and more of the science experiment side of history, once you start reading more and more of the biographies, you'll leave the textbooks behind. I think too many people have a bad taste in their mouth from history class as a kid, where it was just a textbook and they read through and they were like, oh, cool. This group of people traded in purple, 100 pages later. Cool. This city's capital was that. And they also traded in purple. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, there was just such and they used copper, and this is when they first started. And it's not that that's well, it is bad. It's bad when that's where your first starting place with church with history is. It's not that we don't need to know who was trading in purple or who was the first guy to pick up bronze. That's important, but that's really secondary to who were the people who moved through history. We've really moved away from the idea that there were great people Yet there were great people. There were great people and there were terrible people and there were in between people. And we need to start, especially as a church, we know that we have great brothers and sisters in Christ who came before us, and we can certainly celebrate them. And we certainly will find some flaws of theirs as well, but that's okay. Remember, you're going to see them in heaven, so be careful how bad you rip them now because you might have to apologize when you get there.
Yeah, and that's just really it's kind of the difference between reading a book that's an overview of the Revolutionary War or the Civil War and reading letters or a diary from a soldier. Yes, the trade-off is they're not going to give you that breadth and the depth and the understanding of all the political
Mm,
and the military and all those different aspects, but you are going to get a much more intimate look and in some ways, if you can use that term, a more real sense of what was going on by doing that. So I think there's definitely pros and cons of each, but you're really probably better off seeing the primary sources as your primary exposure to these things, and your secondary, your fill in, perhaps, is some of these things that give you a better sense of the overall picture. Yeah, I agree with that completely. Now, we talked a little bit about different eras. Are there any particular events in church history that just come to mind as things that, the average Christian really ought to be aware of what took place when this happened?
Well, if you want something that I think is pretty important that almost nobody talks about, that we did a recently deep dive on this, what we call deep dives on our show, is the church history of Ethiopia. A lot of people don't really have kind of any knowledge of what happened with Ethiopia. You'll see in Acts actually that the Ethiopian eunuch comes up before Cornelius, and then the Ethiopian eunuch kind of goes off, and then maybe you have a vague idea that there might have been a Christian kingdom out there somewhere in Africa, off and on. But if there's a history that I would recommend going and taking a look at, it is full of cautionary tales for us today. It's full of interesting things that happen, and it's a very old church there. And the reformers use that movement too as an example of, hey, here's proof that you don't have to be Catholic to follow God. Look at this other church here in Africa that's existed. So if you're just looking for like interesting tidbits, I highly recommend going through trying to understand what happened in Ethiopia. Although it can be a bit of a headache, it's a lot of fun. And it's just very interesting. And again, full of very careful cautionary tales for us. But in more of a realistic sense, if you're looking for practical, how do I just get my teeth in there and start learning the Reformation? You got to know what's going on there, especially what happened with the Puritans and new kind of colonial America is extremely important to know if you are an American or you've lived in England and you're in any way influenced by Anglicans, Puritans, Baptists, or any of those sides of Christianity, which it's hard to imagine how many of us aren't, somewhere in that shade, influenced by them. You really need to know, why did they come to America? What were they looking for? What happened in the Salem witch trials? How did all of this get started? Because when you kind of have an idea of how all that got started, it really, I think, helps keep you from being swayed here and fro by politics or just culture or things like that today. I think it helps you understand why the churches in America, you often hear people say, why is there so many different denominations, or why do
Yeah.
churches look like this or look like that? A lot of that can be found in the colonializing of America. What happened that brought these people over? What were they running from? Why did they start it this way? And what happened to break some of those systems down? I think that's a really important area for just generally understanding how you got to where you are and why you are the way you are. Too often we kind of divorce Christianity in America, or religion and state, or religion from history, but trying to understand, like you said, the Revolutionary War, without understanding the preachers that preached from the 1750s and 60s, or even further, yeah, trying to understand the Revolutionary War without the Great Awakening that happened before it. It's very difficult to put that in context, and without understanding the Great Awakening, you have to understand that they had all kind of fallen asleep. They weren't following God. Why did they start following God? Well, that started back, and all these things start to interconnect. And so I think colonial America and the Great Awakening are really important parts of history for a lot of us that kind of spend a little more time with, and study a little bit more too. If I can recommend another interesting period for people, and we're just going through periods of history here. Uh, the rise of liberalism in the late 1800s and early 1900s is really pivotal. What brought about, and then back then, liberalism doesn't mean what it is today. I mean, your audience is probably aware, but it's the idea that the Bible is no longer inerrant, that, this kind of meshing of evolutionary Darwinism, moving with psychology, moving with all these sweeping academic forces that just kind of knocked the Bible and Christianity down a peg in Europe and tried to do the same thing and to a degree did in America. That is really important for us to understand what happened there and what stopped it from completely taking over in America and how that's kind of replaying itself again and what happened to people who stood up to it because Charles Spurgeon very famously very early called out and said there is something going on where our institutions are strong in Christianity and then over time they just flop over and give it up basically. He called this the downgrade controversy and he actually used the phrase and he used church history to prove it. He said, look at church history. And they used examples from church history of an institution being strong and then collapsing. And we know this happens today. Look at Harvard and Yale. They were founded as Christian institutions, but we do not see them as. At the time, Princeton Theological Seminary would have been considered a very strong Christian institution. We wouldn't look at it that way anymore, but that would have been an example of a fellow at the time that he would have looked to. This downgrade controversy didn't stop in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. It continues to this day. Spurgeon stood against it and was completely demolished by everybody for it. Hated on, attacked, slandered, broke relationships. His denomination voted him down 2000 to 7 that you're wrong. And even though you're the biggest pastor in Britain and we've all had you come to our church
Yep.
and do rallies and stuff, we're basically saying you're out of line. He held on to that and died before he ever saw the fruit of it. But one of the reasons Charles Spurgeon's name is known today by so many of us is because people looked back and said he was right, though. Like what he was talking about is
Yeah.
happening, and time proved him correct. And he just happened to be ahead of his time and helped blaze the trail. That's really important for us to understand that that didn't stop. And I think a lot of us are being called to get out there and start speaking that truth because we're living through another downgrade controversy.
Oh, that's all really good, really helpful, and just to add to those, one area that I would suggest people need to have a basic familiarity with, and we're going to leave out 99% of things that people ought to know. Highlighting one at risk of minimizing the others, you got to know a little bit about the different councils and the creeds that came out of those. So Chalcedon, Nicaea, things like this, for two reasons. One is because of the controversy of the day, the theological arguments of the day. Those really were what produced these orthodox statements on things like the Trinity or whatever else, that have served the church for millennia. The second reason is because those same exact things are used by critics of Christianity in ways that are very dishonest. They'll always say, that Constantine, they invented the deity of Christ, for example, at such and such a council, and no, these things are historically documented. We know what the vote was on the different things they took vote on. We know who had this position, who had that position. These things, it's real tangible history, and having an awareness of that, one, helps you appreciate those who have gone before. Secondly, it helps you understand what orthodox things are regards to these really important theological issues. And thirdly, it prevents you from being, like you said earlier, knocked to and fro by these different attacks that come about the faith.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And also just when you understand the councils and stuff as well, you also it helps you to kind of paint the color. I history is so much of undoing what you've already learned in history. So much of what we learn in history is like, oh, I thought I knew that the Roman story was really simple. That okay, once Constantine became the emperor, he became Christian. He made Christianity the law of the land. Everyone was Christian. And if you look at what happened the next 150 years as they fought through council after council, you realize that can't be what happened because there was so much back and forthing. And there were
Yep.
emperors who were, solid, and then there'd be the apostate would come in, and then there'd be the Arian would come in, and they were fighting
Yeah.
back and forth over who was going to actually be in control the entire time. And so in reality, we learn a little bit of history, and then we had to kind of go back through and have it fleshed out and realize the version that we learned is not correct. And then we get more, it's like a picture, it comes more into frame and more into focus, it gets more color, and we start to really see it for what it really is, and we see it faults and accomplishments, and it becomes quite beautiful when you can kind of look at that era and go, man, I know the characters, I know the people, I know what they were going through, and I see how they fought for it. So much of church history is just seeing great people of God stand up for truth and fight and fight and fight for that truth against all cultural, political, economic, social odds. And it's just amazing how often it just looks like the deck is stacked against them. And then lo and behold, 20 or 30 years later, they're the winners and they're standing on top of it. Martin Luther is a great example of that. He was so just not looking like he could win that battle. He had the Catholic Church was just an overwhelming hurricane of tsunami force. I mean, they controlled your life after death. They controlled if they could kill you. They controlled what happened to your books. They controlled the schooling institutions that hosted you. They controlled the princes. They had all this overwhelming power, and yet Martin Luther stands up to them, and 30 to 50 years later, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years later, we're all quite grateful that he did. That's just one, but there's so
Yeah.
many examples like that.
No, absolutely. Now you've mentioned different names that have come up. Initially I wanted to ask what are some of those names you've got to know, but I think immediately people already know they ought to know the Luther, the Calvin, the Augustine, uh, Whitfield, the Puritans, all these people. What are some names that you'd recommend people get to know, given that you're kind of doing these deep dives on different historical figures within the church? Are there other names that maybe a little bit lesser known that you'd really recommend? You got to know this person's story.
I think you should look into Ambrose. He has a really amazing story. I only recently found him. He helped bring Augustine to Christ, and he has this really incredible story of the emperor was basically siding with the Arians, trying to get a church for themselves. Ambrose and his people wall themselves into the church and just stay there. And they go, "You can not have access to this church because you're going to preach heresy inside of Christ's pulpit. We won't let you." And they just hold down this fort for days until eventually the city riots enough to
Wow.
get the guards to give up, basically, and they hold down the fort. This happens the same year he brings Augustine to Christ, a little bit later after that. And it's just, and he gives a sermon in the middle of that whole thing that we're going to air on our show at some point. But it's just an incredible thing, like things like that, things that are totally just strange. Ambrose is a great one. He has a lot of writings and he's very intelligent. If you're looking for an early church father who gets totally looked over a lot, I highly recommend maybe checking Ambrose out. He's a really good one. Again, he helped lead Augustine to Christ. Augustine had nothing but high praise for Ambrose. And I think he's a really kind of good one for the early guys. If you're getting a little bit further on, I there's a lot. Sometimes people will argue back and forth on this, but I think there's nothing wrong with reading some of Anselm and Aquinas. I think they have some really interesting logical arguments for God, which I find kind of interesting to think of the medieval era where they're trying to prove God's existence. It's like, didn't everyone assume God at that point? But no, not quite. They must not have because they felt the need to defend him and write a lot about him. And then when you move into more of the Reform era, Savonarola is another one. He's right before the Reformation. He ends up taking over the city of Venice. He has a really interesting story, and his whole fighting to the end is kind of just an interesting one too. If you're looking for just a interesting fellow, Savonarola is a one that John Calvin really looked up to. Then you get to the Reformation era. You have your big guys like, of course, Martin Luther, John Calvin. Um, but if you're looking for some lesser known ones, they're a little bit later, so I guess not really reformers, are more in the Puritan. John Flavel is one. He has one of the most incredible stories of preaching a sermon and then dying, and then this person remembering this sermon 80 years later and getting saved from it, just kind of playing it back in their own head, which is just one of the most fascinating stories of all of church history. I think that God can do that. But just does a bunch of different things like that. So there's John Flavel, he's got some good writings. Thomas Brooks wrote one of the best, I think, books in church history, which is Precious Remedies Against Satan's
Yes.
Devices. And it's very late for me. I don't know
Yep.
if I said the name of that, but it's a really good one. I think more people need that in their life for just practical tips on how to fight temptation. It's a really solid book. Moving forward a little bit, uh, man, there's so many. I literally half of these are just ones I'm working with recently because there's just so many I can't even remember them all. But John G. Payton and his story is a name that everybody should know. He went to an island of cannibals and the things he suffered for Christ, and yet his perseverance in the 1800s, absolutely the model of a person that we should all know about and think about. David Brainerd's another one. His diary is pretty well known. Jonathan Edwards' most famous, most sold book was actually David Brainerd, not his sermons and sinners in the hands of an angry God and that stuff, but it would have been David Brainerd's diary. But these days, it's not as well known, and yet you can't really get the Great Awakening without Jonathan Edwards. You can't really get the Missionary Century without Diary of David Brainerd, and you actually don't get the Second Great Awakening without Jonathan Edwards either, because it was this book that helped lead Asahel Nettleton to Christ, who started the Second Great Awakening as well. So all this stuff
Yeah.
connects. Um, it's just incredible how much of church history is just interlocked together, where you can't go forward without knowing what happened before, because it's just these things are all really blended together,
Yeah.
quite amazingly. So yeah,
And a lot of these people benefited from, read, were even
yeah.
taught by these other figures in church history. And like you said, it's all interconnected. And there's so many great people to learn about. And now you and your team over with Revive Studios, you're really doing the things that we talked about. You are giving the overview of these important eras, important people, important movements within society at large, but also giving those firsthand documents with revived thoughts in the form of sermons. But you have these other programs as well. Can you speak to a little bit about what you and the others at Revive Studios are doing with the various podcasts and everything else of really helping educate and share your love of church history with others?
Yeah, we're just really all about trying to bring church history to life in different ways. We've done that in through our main show, Revive Thoughts, which is bringing these sermons back to life. We brought back over 180. I think we're really close to 200 at this point.
Wow.
And sometimes we take a break and we'll have like a conversation, or we'll tell a story really interesting stories. We had one called Minister to Monsters that we did a couple weeks ago, where we walked through a gentleman who basically had to be the chaplain to the Nazis that were taken to the Nuremberg trials, and what that would have been like to try to share the gospel with quite literally the worst people, some of the worst people that have ever lived, and the impact that that had, and what how that worked and how it looked, and just that question
Wow.
of, do you believe in Jesus so much that you would share it with these kinds of people who are responsible for the deaths of millions? Because that's certainly a challenge to our faith, right? Jesus is for everybody, but it's hard to imagine that he's for Nazis as well, right? So we have those kind of conversations, look at things like that. We also have a show, Martyrs and Missionaries. My wife runs it, very, very good. She honestly reads a lot of the autobiographies, so she tends to go for like the original writings themselves, and then tells you the story of the missionaries more from their own words and their own quotes and their stuff. She tries to get to the source material, not those secondary and third sources, but she really sticks with the primary
Yeah.
sources. And I think it tells a lot of missionary stories in a way that has not been told before. We also have other projects. We do Revive Devos. When we get those going, we just kind of do little short Devos every day from different important people through history. Like we had Lemuel Haynes, Jonathan Edwards, Watchman Nee, John Sung. We've had all kinds of different people that we featured. Some, not all from the same side of the political spectrum. Andrew Murray, Richard Baxter, St. Augustine. Just a lot of different people on that show. We had another show, Forgotten Hollywood, with Chris Wineland. If you're more interested in entertainment or art, uh, this person pitched it to our show, and I was like, man, I don't know. Is this something? He did an amazing job of showing how much Hollywood and the church have intersected throughout history, and it's without a doubt uh, the 10 of the most interesting, fascinating episodes you can possibly listen to. And you'd be surprised how much Christianity and Hollywood have actually intersected and sometimes teamed up, sometimes fought. It's just an interesting series. Those are just some of our shows. So that's what we're doing, just trying to bring church history to people and trying to podcast to people in a way that will reach them. And we've received lots of thank you letters and comments from people, and people have been saying that this stuff is being used to move them and help them grow closer to
Mm.
God, encourage them, and just a bunch of other things. So it's absolutely mind blowing that God is using uh, not our work. I mean, we're just kind of the vessel of these stories of the past and these works from greater people than us to help encourage and convict people today.
Absolutely. So you've got lots of wonderful stuff going on. Like I said, I'm going to link to all those different things in the show notes. You can check that out at reasonabletheology.org/Troy. If someone wants to go to one place to see all the things that you've got going on, where should they head?
ReviveThoughts.com, ReviveStudios.com. You'll find it all on there. And we pretty much stick with with podcasts, so you can also just go to Spotify and just hit revived and just start, subscribing to most of the things there are. So you'll be fine. So yeah, just look for us. We stick in the podcast realm for the most part, though we may be looking to move a little bit out of that realm as time goes on.
Excellent. Well, appreciate you taking the time to talk to me with again. Our guest has been Troy Frasier, Revive Studios, Revive Thoughts. Really highly recommend that you open up whatever you're using to play podcasts on. And next time you're on a run, mowing the lawn, washing the dishes, whatever you do when you listen to podcasts, check one of them out. You'll be glad you did. And we'll put links into that in the show notes for this episode. Troy, thanks so much for joining me once again.
Clay, thank you so much for having us on. And if you're looking for a good episode of Revived Thoughts to check out, maybe check out the episode where Clay here will be reading a sermon for us. That is very exciting. That will be coming out on our show. That will be by Philip. That will be on Philip Melanchthon.
Absolutely. It was fun to do, and we'll be linking to that as well and sharing that out on social media and everywhere else. So thanks a lot, Troy.
Thank you.